A Death in Paris, 1328. The candles in the royal bedchamber at the Château de Vincennes-Gutter, their light dancing across the ashen face of the man in the bed. It is the first day of February 1328, and Charles IV, King of France, is dying. He's only 33 years old. Around him, the court physicians and anxious nobles are already shadows of a future crisis, for the king leaves no son, no clear heir to the most powerful crown in Christendom. His wife is pregnant, but the sex of the child is a question mark hanging over the fate of a kingdom. This moment of hushed panic, of whispered lineage and dreaded precedent, is where our story truly begins. Not with a battle cry, but with a death rattle. For the dynasty that has ruled France for over 300 years, the direct line of Hugh Capet is about to snap. What follows is a legal, diplomatic and eventually military struggle, so protracted and complex that later, historians searching for a neat container would label it the 100 Years' War. But for the people living through its first shuddering convulsions, it was simply a crisis of succession, a feudal dispute that spiraled catastrophically out of control. If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. The death of Charles IV presented France with an unprecedented constitutional puzzle. The Capetian kings had been famously blessed with male heirs for centuries, a divine affirmation of their right to rule known as the royal touch. But now, the last of Philip IV the Fair's three sons, Louis of Arc, Philip V, and finally Charles thus, had all died without leaving a surviving male child. The legal framework for such an event was untested. When Charles's widow gave birth to a daughter, the French magnates faced their decision. Could the crown pass through a woman? The precedent set just over a decade earlier suggested not. When Louis of Arc died in 1316, his daughter Joan was set aside in favour of his brother Philip V. The same pattern repeated for Philip V in 1322. His daughters passed over for Charles IV. The principle, later codified as the Salic law, was taking shape. The Kingdom of France, a sacred entity, could not be tarnished or transmitted through the female line. It was a distinctly French interpretation of ancient Frankish custom, one now invoked with decisive force. An assembly of barons and prelates, the Grand de France, declared that no woman nor her son could succeed to the monarchy of France. Their gaze then turned to the remaining candidates. There were two main contenders, both linked by blood to the extinct royal line through their mothers. The first was Philip, Count of Valois. He was the son of Philip IV's brother, Charles of Valois, making him a nephew of the last king and a first cousin to the dead monarchs. He was a mature, experienced French magnate, well known and respected by the very peers who would choose him. The second was a teenager across the Channel, Edward III, King of England. His claim came through his mother Isabella, the only surviving child of Philip IV. By the logic of primogeniture used in England and many other European realms, Edward, as the closest direct descendant of Philip IV, had a strong hereditary right. But the French barons did not see it that way. Edward's claim was doubly tainted. It descended through a woman, and it was held by the King of England. The prospect of placing the French crown on the head of a ruler whose primary interest lay across the sea, who already held the troublesome Duchy of Gascony as a French vassal, was unthinkable. It threatened the very sovereignty and independence of the French state. In May 1328, the Grands formally awarded the regency to Philip of Valois. When he was crowned Philip VI at Reims Cathedral, the sacred site of French coronations for centuries, the matter seemed settled by sacred right and feudal consensus. Edward III, however, was not ready to let it go. In 1328, he was just 16, under the shadow of his formidable and notoriously manipulative mother, Isabella, and her lover Roger Mortimer, who had effectively ruled England after deposing Edward's father, Edward II. For the moment, pragmatism won. To secure his continued possession of the vital Duchy of Gascony, the last substantial English territory in France, source of the prize Bordeaux wines and crucial tax revenues, Edward was compelled to do homage to Philip VI. In 1329, at Amiens Cathedral, he performed a solemn but deliberately vague act of fealty. The English chroniclers insisted it was only homage for Gascony, a limited feudal obligation. The French court interpreted it as liege hommage, an acknowledgement of Philip as his sovereign lord for the French lands, implicitly accepting his kingship. This ambiguity was a ticking clock. Meanwhile, Philip VI began his reign by solidifying his position with a show of military strength, leading an army to crush a rebellion in Flanders at the Battle of Cassel in August 1328. He was acting every bit the confident, divinely anointed King of France. Tensions simmered for a decade, a Cold War fought in diplomatic chambers and legalistic squabbles. The flashpoint, as so often in medieval geopolitics, was not France itself, but the complex interconnected web of alliances in the Low Countries. When Philip VI moved to assert influence in the county of Flanders and against England's allies in the region, Edward III saw his opportunity. In 1337, Philip, citing a litany of feudal breaches and what he deemed Edward's contumacy, made the fateful decision to confiscate the Duchy of Gascony. This was not just a punitive measure, it was an existential threat to the English crown's continental standing and wealth. Edward's response was swift and revolutionary. He rejected the basis of Philip's entire authority. In a deliberate, calculated act of defiance, Edward III resurrected his own claim. He dispatched a challenge to Philip, not as a vassal to his lord, but as a rightful king to a usurper. In it, he famously addressed Philip as Philip, who calls himself King of France. The gauntlet was thrown. The feudal dispute over Gascony had escalated into a dynastic war for the French crown itself. One quirky tidbit from this prelude involves not swords or treaties, but squirrels. In the early 1330s, Philip VI, seeking to undermine Edward's Flemish alliances, imposed an embargo on English wool, the lifeblood of the Flemish cloth industry. In retaliation, Edward imposed an embargo of his own on the export of English wool to Flanders. The economic pain was immense. But in the intricate records of the time, we find curious entries. The English crown also banned the export of another commodity to the continent, live squirrels. Why? Because they were a prized pet among the continental aristocracy, and the embargo was meant to be total, a sign of England's economic leverage even in the most frivolous of luxuries. As the two kingdoms mobilised, the stage was set for a conflict neither could have imagined would span generations. Philip VI held the advantages of wealth, population, and the sacred legitimacy of his coronation. Edward III possessed a more unified kingdom, a formidable navy, and the tactical genius of a military mind that would soon prove itself. But at its core, the war that was about to begin was founded on a legal fiction and a political calculation. Edward may not have truly believed he could become King of France in Paris, but by asserting the claim, he transformed a defensive war for Gascony into an offensive one for ultimate prize, justifying enormous expenditure and galvanising his nation. Scholars still debate whether Edward III ever genuinely intended to conquer and rule all of France, or if the claim was always a brilliant piece of political leverage, a grand bargaining chip to secure a much larger independent Aquitaine. What is undeniable is that the death of a childless king in 1328 had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured the ambitions, legalisms, and martial pride of two nations, setting them on a collision course that would define the next 116 years. The War of Two Edwards. The declaration had been made, the banners unfurled, but in 1337 the Grand War for the French crown began not with a thunderous invasion, but with a fizzle of failed alliances and empty treasuries. Edward III's masterstroke, or so he believed, was to open a second front far from the contested lands of Gascony. His strategy hinged on the northeast, on the rich rebellious cloth towns of Flanders and the powerful princes of the Holy Roman Empire. He spent a fortune, literally shipping the royal crown jewels to Cologne as collateral, to build a grand coalition against Philip VI. He was proclaimed imperial vicar by the emperor, granting him theoretical authority to command German princes. It was a paper empire, a coalition held together by English gold, and it would prove brittle. The first major campaign in 1339 was a lavish, destructive parade through the Cambrésis region of northeastern France, a chevauchée, a large-scale raid designed to pillage, burn, and demonstrate the French king's inability to protect his own people. Towns went up in smoke, but Philip VI, cautious and perhaps bewildered by Edward's indirect approach, refused to give the pitched battle Edward so desperately needed to win decisively. The campaign ended with Edward's money exhausted and his German allies melting away. The war needed a spark, a clear and unequivocal victory. It would come unexpectedly not on land, but on the water. Control of the English Channel was the sinew connecting Edward's dual kingdoms. In 1340, Philip VI amassed a great fleet, drawn from his own royal navy and the seasoned mariners of Genoa. in the estuary of the Zwin near the port of Sluis in Flanders. His intention was unambiguous: to secure a naval bridgehead for an invasion of England itself. The armada, perhaps as many as 200 ships, was formidable, but it was also poorly managed, chained together in a defensive mass near the coast. When Edward III, having rushed back from England to confront the threat, sighted this vast forest of masts on June 24, 1340, he's said to have remarked, "I have long desired to fight the French, and now, by the grace of God and St. George, I will." The Battle of Sluys that followed was less a naval engagement in the modern sense and more a floating infantry battle. The English fleet, smaller but more manoeuvrable and packed with deadly longbowmen, closed with the anchored French line. The carnage was horrific. English archers darkened the sky with arrows, clearing the French decks of defenders before the English men-at-arms boarded the immobilized enemy vessels. The fighting was hand-to-hand, savage, and confined to the claustrophobic wooden platforms of the ships. French and Genoese crews were slaughtered, their vessels captured or sunk. Contemporary chroniclers, prone to exaggeration, claimed the sea was red with blood and that one could walk from ship to ship across the floating wreckage. While the numbers are debated, the outcome was not. The French fleet was annihilated. It was the first great English triumph of the war, and it secured English control of the Channel for a generation, thwarting any invasion threat and ensuring men and supplies could flow freely to the continent. In the flush of this victory, Edward entered Ghent and, in a dramatic ceremony, formally assumed the title and arms of the King of France, quartering the golden lilies of France with the English lions. It was a potent piece of political theatre, declaring his intention not just to fight Philip but to replace him. Yet despite Sluys, the war again stalled. Edward was bankrupt, his Flemish allies were fractious, and a truce was arranged. For 6 years, a tense peace prevailed, punctuated by localised fighting, particularly around Gascony, where a brilliant English knight, Sir Walter Manny, fought a spirited war of sieges and skirmishes. But the core issue remained unresolved. The stalemate was broken by an event of staggering consequence, one that shifted the entire strategic calculus: the Breton War of Succession. In 1341, Duke John III of Brittany died without a direct heir. The succession was contested between his half-brother, John of Montfort, who had English sympathies, and his niece, Joan of Penthièvre, whose husband, Charles of Blois, was a nephew of Philip VI. France backed Blois. England, seeing a perfect opportunity to open a new front on a large independent peninsula, backed Montfort. For nearly 2 decades, Brittany became a microcosm of the larger war, a bloody playground where English and French forces and their Breton partisans tested each other. It was here that the brutal realities of the war were laid bare, far from the grand chivalric ideals. One of the most iconic, if apocryphal stories to emerge was the siege of Hennebon, where Montfort's ferocious wife, Joanna of Flanders, famously led a charge to break the siege, earning her the nickname Jeanne la Flamme. This protracted Breton conflict served as a constant drain and a military academy for both sides. It also provided the context for one of the era's most curious and tragic side stories, a tale of chivalry turned to farce and horror. In 1341, during a localised siege at the fortress of Caen, the famous French knight Robert Bertrand, known as the Knight of the Green Lion, was captured. His English captor, Sir Thomas Dagworth, agreed to release him on parole, a chivalric promise to return to captivity at a later date to settle his ransom. Bertrand, however, appealed to Philip VI, who forbade him from honouring his word, arguing his duty to the king overrode his chivalric oath. The incident caused an international scandal, eroding the very codes of conduct that made aristocratic warfare somewhat manageable. It was a sign that this was becoming a different kind of war, where national allegiance was starting to trump feudal honour. By the mid-1340s, Edward III was ready for his grand gamble. The Breton front had tied down French resources, and his treasury had partially recovered. His new strategy was audacious. Rather than attack in the north or reinforce Gascony, he would strike at the very heart of Norman power, landing in the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy. The aim was not conquest, but devastation. He would cut a fiery swath through some of the richest lands of France, living off the land, demonstrating Philip's impotence, and, crucially, luring the French king into a decisive battle on ground of Edward's choosing. In July 1346, a large English army landed at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue. What followed was a calculated orgy of destruction. Towns like Caen were sacked, their populations terrorised, and the countryside systematically plundered. The chevauchée was both a military, tactic and a form of economic and psychological warfare. As Edward's army, laden with loot, marched eastward towards the safety of Flanders, Philip VI finally gathered his full royal army and gave chase. He was determined to corner this insolent invader and crush him. The two forces converged near a small village north of the River Somme. The place was called Crécy. Scholars still debate the true military value of the chevauchée. Was it a strategically sound way to provoke battle and cripple an enemy's economic base? Or was it ultimately a brutal, counterproductive exercise that fostered enduring hatred and made lasting peace impossible? What is clear is that by the summer of 1346, Edward III had succeeded in his primary goal. He had Philip's full attention. The English army, tired from its march but disciplined and holding a strong defensive position, turned to face the pursuing French host. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter medieval military conventions and cement a legend of English invincibility. At Crécy, the longbow would move from being a feared weapon to a revolutionary force, and the very concept of chivalry would receive a bloody, shocking check against the grim realities of massed infantry and tactical discipline. The Crécy campaign. The English army, weary and coated in the dust of a month-long raid, crested the ridge near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu on the evening of August 25, 1346. Edward III, looking down at the gentle slope before him, the Wadecourt Valley to his right, and the forest of Crécy-Grange to his left, knew this was the place. His devastating chevauchée through Normandy had achieved its final objective. It had drawn the enraged and massive army of Philip VI into a position of English choosing. Edward ordered his men to dismount. The knights and men-at-arms would fight on foot this day. They formed into 3 divisions, or battles, with the right flank commanded by his 16-year-old son, Edward, the Black Prince, in what would be a terrifying baptism of fire. At the forefront of each division, and on the flanks, Edward positioned his true weapon, thousands of Welsh and English longbowmen. They hammered sharpened stakes into the ground before them, a simple but brutal defence against cavalry charge. Then, under a light rain that later cleared, they waited. They were perhaps 12,000 against a French force that may have numbered 30,000 or more, a host glittering with the pride of European chivalry, including the blind King John of Bohemia, who had insisted on being led into battle to strike a blow with his sword. The French arrival was not a coordinated march but a disorganised tide. Philip VI, advised to wait for the full force of his army to assemble and to attack fresh in the morning, found his authority crumbling under the weight of aristocratic impatience. The French nobility, seeing the English arrayed below, were eager for glory, convinced that their heavy cavalry would simply roll over the upstart infantry. As the vanguard, a massive contingent of Genoese crossbowmen, was pushed forward, the late afternoon sun broke from behind the clouds, shining directly into their eyes. Their first volley fell short, then the English longbowmen stepped forward. What happened next was not an exchange of missiles, it was a systemic dismantling. The longbow's rate of fire, perhaps 10 arrows a minute compared to the crossbow's 2 or 3, created a storm of arrows, a phrase used by chroniclers that feels less like hyperbole and more like technical description. The 6-foot yew-staves, drawn to the ear, unleashed arrows with enough force to pierce plate armour at close range. The Genoese were cut to pieces, their retreat blocked by the advancing French cavalry, who, in a fury of class contempt, are said to have ridden them down, crying, "Treason! Kill this rabble!" What followed was a slaughter cloaked in the language of chivalry. Wave after wave of French knights charged up the slope into the arrow storm. The chaos was compounded by a simple, deadly fact. The slope, churned by the rain, and the weight of horses and men became a quagmire. Horses fell, piling upon each other. Knights in heavy armour were trapped, becoming stationary targets for archers who now aimed at the vulnerable points. The visors, the horses' flanks. It was less a battle than a tactical execution. The English men-at-arms, disciplined and holding their line, dispatched those few French knights who reached the stakes. The Black Prince's division was hard-pressed at one point, and a messenger was sent to King Edward asking for aid. The king, watching from a windmill at the rear, famously refused, "Let the boy win his spurs." By nightfall, the field was a horrific tableau of the dead and dying. The flower of French nobility lay in heaps. The Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, the blind king John of Bohemia, found dead amidst a ring of his devoted retinue. Philip VI, wounded by an arrow, was led from the field in despair. French casualties numbered in the thousands. English losses were perhaps in the low hundreds. Crécy was a psychological earthquake. It proved that a well-disciplined, tactically innovative army of commoners and dismounted nobles could annihilate the most prestigious heavy cavalry in Christendom. The longbow was the catalyst, but the victory was built on Edward's choice of terrain, his unified command, and the French army's fatal lack of cohesion. In its immediate aftermath, Edward did not march on Paris. His strategic goal was more pragmatic. He needed a major port to secure his supply lines from England. His army, still laden with loot from Normandy, marched north and laid siege to Calais. This siege would become an epic in itself, a grueling 11-month blockade that demonstrated a different facet of medieval warfare. The citizens of Calais, under their stalwart commander Jean de Vienne, held out with desperate courage, hoping for a relief army that Philip VI, his military strength shattered, could not muster. By the summer of 1347, famine had done what assault could not. The city surrendered. In a moment of calculated ruthlessness that would become legendary, Edward initially demanded that 6 of the town's burghers present themselves with nooses around their necks, offering their lives for the cities. While the story, immortalised by Rodin's sculpture, says they were spared by the intercession of Queen Philippa, the truth is Edward's mercy was hard-edged. He expelled the entire French population of Calais, repopulating it with English merchants and making it a Little England on the continent, a vital commercial and military gateway that would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries. One fringe detail from this period, often overlooked, involves the logistical horror of the campaigns. The English army's march from Normandy to Crécy was not just a path of destruction, it was also a moving biohazard. Thousands of men and horses living off the land created mountains of waste and left behind unburied animals and food scraps. Modern analysis of pollen and parasite egg records from sediment cores near campaign routes suggests these armies left ecological footprints of devastation and disease that lingered for years, small-scale demographic disasters preceding the cataclysm to come. The years following Calais saw a formal truce, but not peace. The war had become a lucrative, if dangerous, profession. In the lull, the concept of the Free Company was born. Bands of discharged soldiers, often mixing English, Gascon, and other nationalities, who sold their services to the highest bidder or simply plundered the French countryside on their own account. They became a state within no state, a permanent bleeding wound on the body of France. Meanwhile, the Breton War ground on, and a new front erupted in the south, in the independent region of Gascony, where Henry of Grosmont, the Duke of Lancaster, led a series of brilliant, sweeping chevauchées that demonstrated the English tactical system could succeed even in more open terrain. Scholars still debate the fundamental question of English intent after Crécy and Calais. Did Edward III's actions reveal a strategy of piecemeal conquest, securing and digesting key territories like Calais and Gascony? Or was he still playing a grand game of leverage, aiming for a negotiated settlement that would grant him an enlarged sovereign Aquitaine in exchange for dropping the royal claim? The capture of Calais suggests a desire for permanent strategic footholds. Yet, the failure to press on to Paris after Crécy also suggests a war of attrition and profit, not of decisive occupation. The truth likely lies in a medieval mindset that saw territory, honour and wealth as intertwined goals, not as a modern strategic blueprint. What is undeniable is that by 1350, France was reeling. Its military prestige was shattered, its northern coast occupied, its countryside terrorised by companies, and its king, Philip VI, died that year, passing a diminished crown to his son, John II. The new king, known as John the Good, inherited a realm in crisis, and the architect of that crisis, Edward III, was not done. He would soon unleash his most potent weapon, his own son, the Black Prince. The next phase of the war would see the English method reach its brutal apex, and France would be forced to endure a humiliation even deeper than Crécy, the capture of its king on the field of battle, the siege master and the Black Death, with Calais secured as an English staple port and a dagger pointed at the heart of northern France. A grim new rhythm settled over the conflict. The grand set-piece battle was replaced by the slow, grinding agony of the siege and the lightning-fast terror of the chevauchée. and master of both in this period was Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, the Black Prince. His nickname, a posthumous label whose origin is debated, some say for his black armour, others for his ferocity, came to embody an era of English martial supremacy that was as brilliant as it was brutal. Stationed as the King's Lieutenant in Gascony from 1355, the Prince perfected the art of the punitive raid. His great chevauchée of 1355 was a masterpiece of controlled devastation. From Bordeaux, he led a relatively small but highly mobile army eastward through Armagnac and Languedoc, all the way to the Mediterranean coast near Narbonne. The aim was not to hold territory, but to burn it, to destroy the tax base of the French crown, to demonstrate the impotence of King John II, and to lure the French into another disastrous battle. He returned to Bordeaux laden with plunder, having ravaged one of the wealthiest regions of France, and leaving a scar of smoke and ruin hundreds of miles long. The following year, 1356, the Prince launched an even more audacious raid north from Gascony, aiming to link up with an English army under the Duke of Lancaster advancing from Brittany. It was a high-risk manoeuvre, a deep thrust into enemy territory. King John II, seeing a chance to capture the famed English prince and redeem the shame of Crécy, moved with unexpected speed and force. He intercepted the prince's army, now burdened with a massive train of loot and weary from its marches near the city of Poitiers. The Black Prince, outnumbered and desperate, offered to return his plunder and swear a 7-year truce. John II, confident in his overwhelming numbers and the chivalric obligation to give battle, refused. He wanted a prisoner, not a promise. On September 19, 1356, near the fields of Maupertuis, the armies clashed. The prince, displaying tactical genius born of desperation, positioned his dismounted men-at-arms and archers in a strong defensive position hedged by thickets and a creek, with his baggage train parked as a protective flank. The French, perhaps learning half a lesson from Crécy, also dismounted many of their men-at-arms for the initial attack, but they repeated the fatal error of piecemeal assaults. The 1st French Division, on foot, advanced through the narrow lane between the natural obstacles. English and Gascon archers, positioned on the flanks, unleashed a torrent of arrows. The fighting in the bottleneck was ferocious, hand to hand, but the English line held. Then, in a critical moment, the Black Prince launched a small mounted reserve of Gascon cavalry in a countercharge against the 2nd, mounted French division that was still forming up. This caused confusion and delay. Seizing the initiative, the Prince then ordered a general mounted attack. The English and Gascon men-at-arms remounted and charged downhill into the disorganised French lines. The battle dissolved into a chaotic melee where the French numerical advantage meant nothing. The climax came when a fresh English force held in reserve and led by the Captal de Buch crashed into the French rear. Panic spread. The French army disintegrated, and in the midst of the rout, King John II, fighting valiantly, was surrounded and captured. It was a catastrophe beyond French comprehension. Their king, the sacred person of the realm, was now a prisoner of the English. The political and moral authority of the Valois monarchy crumbled in an instant. The capture of King John created a power vacuum in France that was filled not by orderly regency, but by chaos. The Dauphin, the future Charles V, was a sickly young man of 18, thrust into the role of regent for a captive king. The French state was bankrupt, its military shattered, and its population seething under the twin burdens of war taxation and the depredations of the roaming free companies, those bands of discharged soldiers left idle by truces. In 1358, this resentment exploded in 2 simultaneous revolts that brought France to the brink of dissolution. In Paris, the merchant provost Etienne Marcel led a bourgeois revolt against the Dauphin, seeking political reforms and leveraging the chaos to increase the city's power. Meanwhile, in the countryside of northern France, a vast apocalyptic peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie erupted. Driven to madness by the constant pillaging of both English and French armies, who often treated the peasantry as a resource to be mined, the Jacques rose with horrifying violence, burning castles, slaughtering nobles, and unleashing generations of pent-up class hatred. The nobility, temporarily setting aside their differences, crushed the revolt with even greater savagery. The Dauphin eventually regained control of Paris, but the message was clear. The social contract of feudalism was breaking down under the strain of total war. Amidst this political and social inferno, the war's most impartial and devastating actor made its entrance. It had been spreading along trade routes from the east for years. In 1347 it had arrived in Sicily. By 1348 it was in Marseille, and as the Black Prince campaigned and kings were captured, it seeped into every town and village. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, reached its pandemic peak in Europe between 1347 and 1351. But its recurrent waves throughout the latter half of the century acted as a grim reset button on all human endeavour, including war. Its impact was paradoxically double-edged. It killed perhaps a third to half of Europe's population, creating a severe labour shortage that would ultimately empower the lower classes and weaken the feudal economic model. It also temporarily crippled the ability of both nations to wage war, as armies became vectors of disease and monarchs struggled to raise taxes from a decimated populace. The plague did not distinguish between English and French, it simply killed. For a time, the sheer scale of human suffering made the dynastic quarrel over a crown seem grotesquely trivial. One quirky, macabre tidbit from this plague-ridden interlude involves the perceived medical expertise of the time. In a desperate attempt to avoid miasmas, bad air, thought to carry the disease, some military commanders, it is said, took to ordering their siege engines to fire not stones, but bundles of fragrant herbs and incense over castle walls, hoping to sweeten the air and ward off the pestilence, a futile but poignant gesture of pre-scientific understanding in the face of apocalyptic horror. The immediate aftermath of Poitiers saw a desperate France forced to the negotiating table. In 1359, Edward III launched one final massive chevauchée, the Rheims campaign, aiming to be crowned King of France in its traditional cathedral city. The French adopted a strategy of avoiding battle and garrisoning strongholds, and a harsh winter combined with effective scorched earth tactics foiled Edward's plan. Exhausted, both sides agreed to terms. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, later ratified at Calais, was a high watermark for English ambitions. In it, Edward III renounced his claim to the French crown in return for something arguably more tangible, a vastly enlarged Aquitaine. He was to hold in full sovereignty, no homage required, an area covering almost a third of modern France from the Pyrenees to the Loire, plus Calais and its hinterland. In exchange, King John II was to be ransomed for the astronomical sum of 3 million gold écus. It was a peace bought with territory and gold. For a moment it seemed the war was over, concluded in England's overwhelming favour. Scholars still debate whether the Treaty of Bretigny represented a lost opportunity for a lasting peace, or was fundamentally unworkable from the start. Could a sovereign English state exist within the heart of France, dividing the realm, or was conflict inevitable once the French crown regained its strength? The treaty required the mutual cessions to be finalised by later land transfers, a process that quickly bogged down in disputes. The Dauphin Charles, now effectively ruling, had no intention of letting such a vast territory slip away permanently if he could help it, and King John II himself, in a bizarre postscript, would complicate everything. After being released to raise part of his ransom, he voluntarily returned to captivity in England in 1364 when one of the hostages left in his place. His son, Louis of Anjou, broke his parole and escaped. John, citing chivalric honour, felt compelled to return. He died in luxurious captivity in London later that year, leaving his far more capable son, Charles V, as king. The Peace of Bretigny was a fragile truce built on French weakness. As soon as French strength returned, the treaty's paper promises would be tested by fire and steel, led by a king who preferred the tactics of the fox to those of the lion. Poitiers, the king's ransom. The Kingdom of France in the autumn of 1356 was a crown without a head. The physical person of King John II was a captive in the London residence of the Savoy Palace, but his absence created a metaphysical crisis that permeated every level of society. The monarch was not merely a ruler, he was the Lord's anointed, the sacred centre of the political and cosmic order. His capture at Poitiers was interpreted by many as a sign of divine displeasure, a judgment on the realm itself. The task of picking up the shattered pieces fell to his son, the Dauphin Charles. 18 years old, slight of build and described as sickly, Charles faced a perfect storm, a bankrupt treasury, a decimated nobility, roaming mercenary companies pillaging at will, and twin rebellions from the merchant class and the peasantry. His initial attempts to govern through an Estates General, a representative assembly desperate to impose reforms and control taxation, only highlighted his weakness. The years 1357-1358 were perhaps the lowest point for the French monarchy in the entire war, a time when the very concept of France as a unified kingdom teetered on the brink of disintegration. The financial instrument of this crisis was the king's ransom, the sum agreed upon for John II's release, initially set at 4 million gold écus and later formalised in the Treaty of Bretigny at 3 million, was not just a number, it was an economic weapon. To put it in perspective, the annual royal revenue of France at the time was roughly 2 million écus. The ransom was an impossible burden, designed to cripple the French state for a generation. To raise the first instalment, the Dauphin was forced to devalue the coinage, a desperate move that sparked further inflation and unrest, most famously the Parisian revolt led by Étienne Marcel. Marcel, seizing the moment, attempted to transform the monarchy into a constitutional one, holding the Dauphin virtually prisoner and forcing him to endorse radical reforms. It was only through flight, guile, and the eventual backlash against Marcel's own violent tactics that Charles was able to re-enter Paris and reassert royal authority after Marcel's assassination in 1358. Meanwhile, the countryside burned under a different flame. The Jacquerie was less a political revolt than a spasm of pure nihilistic rage. The peasants, les Jacques, had suffered the unbearable. Their lands were burned by English chevauchés, their stores looted by French royal troops seeking supplies, their families violated by the free companies who saw the populace as prey. When the nobility failed utterly in its fundamental feudal duty to protect them, the social contract snapped. The violence was horrific and indiscriminate. Chronicles tell of knights being forced to eat their own heraldic insignia, roasted on spits, and of noblewomen being raped and murdered. The reprisal, led by the nobleman Charles of Navarre, a rival claimant to the throne himself, and joined by even the English Captal de Buch, was swift and genocidal. Thousands of peasants were massacred, their villages erased. The Jacquerie was crushed, but its memory seared into the consciousness of the nobility, a terrifying glimpse of the abyss that lay beneath the feudal order. Amidst this domestic inferno, the diplomatic process ground on. The Treaty of Bretigny, 1360, and its confirming Treaty of Calais were monuments to English success and French desperation. Edward III secured in full sovereignty an enlarged Aquitaine that was essentially a separate kingdom, plus Calais and other territories. He renounced the claim to the French crown, and John II was to be released for the ransom. But the treaty had a fatal flaw. It was contingent on the final transfer of these vast territories, a complex legal and logistical process that was never completed. Key areas, like the strategic Aegineis, remained in disputed hands. This provided the perfect pretext for future conflict. For France, the treaty was a breath of space, a chance to bind its wounds under the leadership of a king who, in a final act of an outdated chivalric code, complicated everything. John II, released to raise funds, voluntarily returned to English captivity in 1364 when his son Louis, Duke of Anjou, a hostage in his place, broke parole and escaped. John died in London later that year, leaving his crown to the Dauphin, who became Charles V. John's good act of honour, earned him his sobriquet, but handed his son a slightly cleaner slate. One quirky and often overlooked detail from John's captivity involves the cultural exchange it fostered. While a prisoner, John lived in considerable style, patronising musicians, poets and artists. He became enamoured with the emerging English style of polyphonic music, and is even credited with helping to popularise the guitar-like gittin in England. His court in exile became an unexpected salon, where the trappings of chivalric culture continued even as the political reality outside was one of utter calamity. With Charles V's coronation in 1364, a new phase began. The new king was the antithesis of his father and grandfather. He was no warrior king. He was frail, scholarly, and inclined to diplomacy and strategy over brute force. He earned his later epithet Charles the Wise, not on the battlefield, but in the council chamber and the treasury. His first task was to address the cancer within his kingdom, the free companies. These bands of unemployed soldiers, a mix of English, Gascon, Navarrese, and French, now terrorised the land with no war to occupy them. Charles found an ingenious if cynical solution. he redirected them. Under the leadership of the Breton knight Bertrand du Guesclin, a tough, unglamorous fighter who was everything the captured nobles at Poitiers were not, the companies were channeled into a crusade in Spain. The goal was to intervene in the Castilian Civil War, installing the French-backed candidate Henry of Trastamara against the English-backed Peter the Cruel. It was a masterstroke. It cleansed France of its plague of brigands, secured a powerful ally in Castile, whose navy would challenge English control of the Channel, and continued the war against England by proxy. Scholars still debate the true character of Charles V's strategy. Was his avoidance of pitched battle a sign of wisdom born from the lessons of Crécy and Poitiers, or was it merely the necessary tactic of a weaker power, a form of organised paralysis? His approach, often called a war of attrition or a strategy of distant defence, involved systematically avoiding major engagements with English field armies. Instead, he focused on strengthening town walls, garrisoning key points, and using small mobile forces under commanders like du Guesclin to harass English supply lines and pick off isolated outposts. He understood that the English chevauchés relied on movement and plunder. By denying them battle and making the countryside less profitable, he could let their campaigns wither on the vine. He also revolutionised French finances through more efficient, if unpopular, permanent taxes like the gabelle, salt tax, and the tile, hearth tax, creating a standing military budget. This patient, unheroic, and profoundly effective approach would form the blueprint for the French recovery. The stage was set for a slow, grinding reversal of fortunes, where castles would be more important than cavalry charges, and fiscal policy would prove as decisive as any arrow storm. The Lion of England was about to find itself ensnared in the webs of the Spider King, the broken peace and Charles the Wise. The peace forged at Bretigny was less a foundation, and more a cracked facade, waiting for the first strong wind to bring it down. That wind began to blow almost immediately from the disputed lands of the enlarged Aquitaine. The treaties had created a legal labyrinth. Edward III, now styling himself Lord of Aquitaine rather than its king, was sovereign there, but the transfer of territories was piecemeal and contested. Local lords found their allegiances forcibly swapped, their ancient feudal ties to Paris severed by a document they had no part in crafting. Into this volatile mix stepped the Prince of Wales, the Black Prince, installed as ruler in Bordeaux in 1363. His court was magnificent, dripping with the plundered wealth of Poitiers, but it was also staggeringly expensive. To fund his lavish state and his military retinue, the prince made a fateful decision. He levied a fouage, a harsh hearth tax, on his new Aquitanian subjects in 1368. This was not just a financial imposition, it was a political blunder of the first order. The nobles of Aquitaine, already chafing under foreign rule, saw their chance. Led by the Count of Armagnac, they sent secret appeals to Paris, to the man they still considered their rightful sovereign, Charles V. They argued that the Black Prince's tax was illegal because, they claimed, the territorial transfers of Bretigny were incomplete, and thus the prince was still a vassal of the French crown and had no right to levy such a tax without the consent of his overlord. For Charles V, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He had spent the years of nominal peace not in celebration, but in meticulous preparation. He had reformed the army, creating a more professional corps under the constable Bertrand du Guesclin. He had fortified towns and castles across the north and along the frontiers of Aquitaine. He had stabilised the currency and built a reliable war treasury through those permanent taxes. He had also, crucially, secured the southern flank by his proxy war in Spain. When the Aquitanian appeal reached him, he did not act rashly. He convened a solemn assembly of legal scholars and peers. Their judgment, a foregone conclusion, was that the appeals were valid and that Edward, as Duke of Aquitaine, was required to answer to his overlord, the King of France, in the Parlement of Paris. It was a legal summons to which the English could not possibly submit without renouncing the sovereignty Bretigny had granted them. In May 1369, Charles V formally declared the Black Prince in breach of his feudal obligations. The war was reignited, not by a bold declaration, but by a cunning legal writ. The English response was predictable, a return to the chevauchée. In 1369, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, led a massive raid from Calais all the way to Bordeaux, burning and pillaging across northern France. But something was different this time. The French army, under strict orders from Charles and his constable du Guesclin, refused to give battle. They shadowed the English, harried their flanks, and retreated into fortified towns. Gaunt's army arrived in Gascony exhausted and having achieved little beyond destruction. The French strategy of distant defence was in full effect. Charles V understood that England's strength was its ability to project a concentrated, deadly field army. France's strength was its depth, its fortifications, and its ability to outlast. He would not play to England's strengths. Meanwhile, du Guesclin, a master of irregular warfare and siegecraft, began a systematic campaign of reconquest, not by seeking epic clashes, but by picking off isolated English-held castles and towns one by one. It was a war of patience, of sappers and bribes, of night assaults and blockades. The Black Prince, meanwhile, was a fading force, stricken by an illness he likely contracted during his Spanish campaign, where he had briefly intervened to restore Peter the Cruel, winning the brutal Battle of Neira in 1367, only to see his victory nullified. He was a shadow of his former self. In 1370, he inflicted a final act of terrible vengeance on the city of Limoges, which had defected to the French. After a siege, he ordered the massacre of its population, an act that even the chronicler Froissart, normally an admirer, recorded with horror. It was the last gasp of the old brutal chevauché logic. By 1371, the prince, his health broken, returned to England, leaving the defence of Aquitaine to others. He would die in 1376, a year before his father. The English position, without its brilliant if brutal champion, began to contract under the relentless, unspectacular pressure of du Guesclin's methods. The French reconquest was slow, methodical, and devastatingly effective. Poitou, Saintonge, and much of the Limousin fell back into French hands. The key was not battlefield victory, but political reintegration. Charles V and du Guesclin were often merciful to towns that surrendered, reaffirming their ancient French liberties and lightening taxes, making the return to Valois rule seem like a liberation rather than a conquest. By the mid-1370s, the great English Aquitaine of Bretigny had shrunk to a coastal strip around Bordeaux and Bayonne. At sea, the new Castilian ally, with its powerful fleet, challenged English naval supremacy, threatening the vital sea lanes to Gascony and even raiding the English coast. The balance of power had fundamentally shifted. One quirky fringe theory from this period involves the legend of the lost sword of Charles V. It was said the king possessed a ceremonial sword, its pommel set with a stone of wisdom, perhaps a large pearl or a piece of polished crystal, which he would consult in times of crisis. Chroniclers wrote that he would stare into it to find clarity. While certainly apocryphal, the story symbolises the era's perception of Charles as a cerebral, almost mystical ruler, whose power came from wisdom and counsel rather than martial force, a sharp contrast to the bladed violence of his predecessors and opponents. The final years of this phase were marked by the passing of the old guard. Du Guesclin died in 1380 while on campaign, bequeathing to France a kingdom largely restored. Charles V, the Spider King, died the same year, his life's work seemingly secure. In England, Edward III had died in 1327, his long reign ending in senility and disappointment, leaving the crown to his 10-year-old grandson Richard II. The war, for all intents and purposes, ran out of steam. Both kingdoms were now ruled by minors. Charles VI of France was also a child, and both faced severe internal pressures. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In France, tax revolts and noble factionalism. The result was a series of long truces, from 1389 onwards, that amounted to a cold peace lasting over a quarter of a century. Scholars still debate whether Charles V's strategy was ultimately a complete success. He undoubtedly saved France from dissolution and rolled back English gains with minimal risk. But did he miss an opportunity to cripple England permanently by refusing ever to seek a decisive battle? His war of attrition reclaimed territory, but did not destroy England's capacity to make war. It merely deferred the confrontation. By focusing on systemic strength over knockout blows, he ensured France's survival, but perhaps also guaranteed the conflict's protraction, leaving the fundamental issue of English-held territory in France unresolved for another generation to seize upon. The peace that followed his death was not a resolution, but an intermission, a long, tense pause during which the rival kingdoms turned inward, only to find that the dynastic beast, though sleeping, was far from dead, and its awakening would be triggered not by a legal summons or a tax dispute, but by the fragile mind of a king and the ruthless ambition of a duchy draped not in fleur-de-lis, but in the bold stripes of Burgundy. Madness, truce, and Burgundy's rise. The long truce that settled over the conflict after 1389 was less a peace, and more a holding of breath. For nearly 30 years, the 100 Years' War existed in a state of suspended animation, its battlefields overgrown, its veterans growing old. In England, Richard II, having weathered the Peasants' Revolt, pursued a policy of détente, even marrying Charles VI's daughter, Isabella. In France, Charles VI, who had taken personal rule in 1388, initially showed promise as a reasonable monarch, earning the nickname Charles the Well-Beloved. The era saw the softening of martial edges. Chivalric culture flourished in the form of extravagant tournaments and courtly literature, a world captured in the illuminated splendour of the très riche heure du Duc de Berry. But this courtly dream was built on a foundation of sand. In 1392, while on a military expedition to Brittany, the young French king suffered a catastrophic psychotic break. Riding through a forest near Le Mans, a sudden noise, a dropped lance according to chronicles, triggered a paralysing episode. Charles drew his sword, screaming that he was surrounded by enemies, and attacked his own retinue, killing several knights before being subdued. The King of France had gone mad. This personal tragedy became a national catastrophe. Charles's insanity was intermittent. He experienced lucid intervals, but his bouts of psychosis grew longer and more severe. He forgot his own name, failed to recognise his wife and children, and at times believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. The monarchy, this sacred centre of the state, was now a vacant throne occupied by a shattered mind. Power vacuum abhorred nature, and into this void rushed the princes of the blood, the king's uncles and brothers, who formed rival factions vying for control of the regency, and, more importantly, the royal treasury. The two most powerful blocs coalesced around the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, charming, cultured, and ambitious, and the king's uncle, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Philip had inherited the mighty Duchy of Burgundy in 1363 and had, through marriage, acquired the rich counties of Flanders, Artois, and Nevers. His power block was not a mere French appanage. It was a nascent state straddling the eastern border of France, economically mighty from Flemish cloth and fiercely independent. The Orléans and Burgundian factions tore the French court and kingdom apart. Their struggle was over patronage, money, and land, fought with assassins' daggers and poisoned propaganda as much as with armies. In 1407, the conflict turned irrevocably bloody. On a dark Paris street, assassins in the employ of John the Fearless, the new, ruthlessly pragmatic Duke of Burgundy, who had succeeded his father Philip, ambushed and brutally murdered Louis of Orléans. The political murder of the king's brother by his cousin was an earthquake. John did not deny it. Instead, he commissioned a theological treatise to justify it as a tyrannicide, claiming Louis was a corrupting influence on the realm and the Queen. France was now plunged into a civil war within the long truce of the Foreign War. The faction loyal to Orléans, led by its new head, the Count of Armagnac, thus becoming the Armagnacs, was driven by a furious desire for vengeance against the Burgundians. This internal fracture was the opportunity England had been waiting for. The détente had died with Richard II, overthrown in 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. The new Lancastrian dynasty was insecure, its title to the throne contested. What better way to solidify a shaky reign than to revive the glorious unifying foreign war of Edward III? But Henry IV was plagued by rebellion and ill health. It was his son, the fiercely martial and devoutly ambitious Henry V, who would seize the moment with both hands. Upon his accession in 1413, Henry faced a kingdom still divided from his father's usurpation. He needed a grand enterprise to unite the English political community. The civil war in France presented a target of unimaginable opportunity. He began by reopening the old claim to the French crown, a claim the Lancastrians had quietly set aside. He demanded not only the old Aquitaine of Bretigny but also Normandy, Anjou, and other territories, a revival of the Plantagenet Empire. When the French, divided and distracted, could not give a coherent answer, Henry had his casus belli. But he did not rush. Henry V's genius was in preparation. He learned the lessons of the previous century. He would not lead a mere chevauchée. He would launch a campaign of conquest, aimed at securing a defensible territorial base in Normandy, the ancient homeland of William the Conqueror. His army, though smaller than the great hosts of Edward III, was supremely professional, well-disciplined and lavishly supplied. In August 1415 he sailed for France. His first objective was the port of Harfleur, which he took after a grueling siege that cost him time and many men to dysentery. With the campaigning season waning and his army reduced, Henry faced a choice: sail home or march overland to the English-held Calais as a show of defiance. He chose the latter, a risky march through enemy territory. The French, for once, managed a semblance of unity. The Armagnac-controlled royal government raised a massive army to intercept him. They were confident, remembering the disasters of Crécy and Poitiers, but believing their numbers and the condition of the English would guarantee victory. They cornered Henry's sick, hungry and exhausted army near the village of Agincourt. The stage was set for one of the most mythologized battles in history, a clash where mud, blood and the relentless English longbow would once again decide the fate of kings, but this time amid the treacherous politics of a kingdom tearing itself in two. One quirky and darkly ironic tidbit from the period of the French Civil War involves the Bal des Ardents, Ball of the Burning Men. In 1393, during one of Charles VI's lucid intervals, a masquerade was held to cheer the Queen. The king and 5 noblemen performed a wild dance dressed as wild men, in costumes made of flax glued to their bodies. A stray torch from the Duke of Orléans set the highly flammable costumes alight. 4 men burned to death. The king was saved only when the quick-thinking Duchess of Berry threw her voluminous skirts over him. The tragedy was seen as an omen of the consuming fires of factionalism about to engulf the realm, and it further damaged the king's fragile psyche. Scholars still fiercely debate the primary cause of the war's reignition in the 15th century. Was it the inherent ambition and insecurity of Henry V, a new king needing a martial legacy? Or was it the profound structural weakness of France, whose internal divisions under a mad king made it an irresistible target? Some argue the war never truly ended, that the truces were always just pauses for recovery. But the scale of Henry's ambition and the completeness of French collapse suggest 1415 was a new war, born from the toxic cocktail of Lancastrian dynastic insecurity and Valois implosion. The Burgundian role is central. Would Henry have dared his gamble if a united France under Guillaume a strong king had stood against him? The answer is almost certainly no. The fracture lines of the French Civil War ran directly to the field of Agincourt, where the absence of a large Burgundian contingent in the French army was as decisive as any arrow. The long truce was over, shattered not by a formal declaration, but by the convergence of one king's calculating ambition and another kingdom's tragic self-inflicted wounds. The Agincourt mythos. The rain fell in a cold, persistent drizzle on the night of October 24th, 1415, turning the freshly ploughed fields between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt into a sea of thick, clinging mud. On this sodden patch of Picardy, the exhausted, disease-ridden army of Henry V prepared for annihilation. They numbered perhaps 6,000, over 1,000 of them sick with dysentery. Arrayed before them, blocking their path to Calais, was a French host that contemporary sources claim, with probable exaggeration, numbered between 12,000 and 25,000. The flower of the Armagnac nobility, eager to erase the shame of previous defeats and win glory against this impudent invader. The English had no chance, or so the French believed, yet by nightfall the following day the mud was churned crimson, and the myth of Agincourt was born, a legend of English martial virtue that would echo for centuries, obscuring the brutal, desperate reality of the battle itself. Henry V's campaign had begun with the grueling siege of Harfleur, which took over a month and cost him nearly a third of his army to battle and dysentery. His decision to march the 120 miles to Calais was a calculated risk, part of a fighting march intended to demonstrate his right to the French crown by crossing the land unchallenged. But the French had finally mobilised. They chose not to harass his flanks but to block his path, confident their numbers would overwhelm him. Henry, a master of psychological warfare, attempted to negotiate, offering to surrender Harfleur and pay for damages in return for safe passage, an offer he knew would be refused. It was a play to position himself as the reasonable party forced into battle. On the eve of the fight, he moved his army into a narrow front, his men-at-arms dismounted in the centre, his thousands of longbowmen on the flanks protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground. Then he gave a speech. Shakespeare's Band of Brothers oration is fiction, but chroniclers agree Henry rallied his troops with themes of righteous cause, English courage, and the grace of God. He then did something extraordinary. He ordered his army to advance. As dawn broke on October 25th, the Feast of St. Crispin, the English archers shouldered their 6-foot yew-bows, pulled their stakes from the mud, and trudged forward until they were just within extreme range of the French lines. They replanted their stakes. The French, who had expected the English to remain defensive, were caught in a chaotic moment of preparation. Their battle plan, such as it was, called for a massive cavalry charge on the flanks to rout the archers, followed by the main body of dismounted men-at-arms to crush the English centre. But the field, narrowed by woods and churned by rain, and thousands of horses, was a bottleneck. The first French cavalry charge was a disaster. Armoured knights on heavy horses sank into the mud, their charge slowed to a struggling trot. They were met by a blizzard of arrows from the English archers. The arrows themselves may not have pierced the best plate armour at range, but they killed the horses, creating a writhing, screaming barrier of fallen steeds and riders in the path of the advancing French men-at-arms, who were now forced to advance on foot in full plate across 300 yards of sucking mud. The battle descended into a horrific close-quarters slog. The French men-at-arms, exhausted from wading through the mire, reached the English line in disordered clots rather than a solid wall. The English men-at-arms, fighting on ground they had chosen, were fresher and more cohesive. The press was so great that many French knights, knocked down by the shoving mass or stumbling in the mud, could not rise under the weight of their armour and drowned in the mire. The English archers, having exhausted their arrows, now entered the fray with mauls, axes and daggers, swarming over the immobilised French nobility with murderous efficiency. The second and third French lines, seeing the carnage, largely melted away. The battle was over in 3 hours. The scale of the French defeat was apocalyptic. Estimates suggest between 6,000 and 10,000 French dead, including 3 dukes, 9 counts, and over 100 other great lords. English losses were remarkably light, perhaps a few hundred. But the battle's most controversial moment came after the fighting had effectively ceased. Henry, hearing a false report of a new French attack on his baggage train, or perhaps a genuine localised counterattack, and fearing his vastly outnumbered army would be overwhelmed if the thousands of prisoners he had taken rearmed themselves, gave a chilling order. The common soldiers were to kill their prisoners. It was a war crime by any standard, a coldly pragmatic slaughter of the French aristocratic elite that had surrendered. The myth of Agincourt often glosses over this final brutal act, focusing instead on the against-all-odds victory. One fringe but persistent legend that emerged from the chaos is the story of the Agincourt Carol and the supposed invention of the middle finger gesture. The story goes that the French threatened to cut off the bow fingers of captured English archers, and after the victory, the English archers waved their intact middle fingers at the defeated French, crying, "See, we still have our plucking fingers." It's a fantastic tale, almost certainly untrue. The gesture has older origins, but it endures as a folkloric echo of the battle's cultural impact, symbolising the defiant common-born archer's triumph over the aristocratic knight. In strategic terms, Agincourt was a shock, but not an immediate war winner. Henry lacked the troops to march on Paris. He returned to England a hero, his dynastic legitimacy cemented, and spent 2 years securing funds and political support. The battle's true power was psychological and political. For the English, it became an immortal legend of divine favour and national superiority. For the French, it was a disaster that deepened the Civil War fissure. The Burgundians, who had pointedly avoided the battle, used the Armagnac defeat to tighten their grip on Paris and the Mad King. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, and the new Armagnac leader, the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, a sickly and hesitant teenager, entered a tense dance of negotiations and sporadic violence. France was now a tripartite entity. The Burgundian state in the east, the Armagnac held south and centre with the Dauphin, and the English in Normandy, where Henry returned in 1417 to begin a systematic, ruthless war of conquest. This was no raid. It was a methodical reduction of Normandy, town by town, castle by castle, with a brutality that mirrored his prisoner order at Agincourt. The stage was being set for a political solution more astounding than any battlefield victory, the prospect of an English king inheriting France itself. Scholars still debate the military lessons of Agincourt. Was it the last, greatest triumph of the longbow, proving the continued supremacy of the English tactical system? Or was it a freak occurrence, a victory handed to Henry by French folly, terrible terrain, and atrocious weather? Modern analyses suggest the latter. The French had the correct components: cavalry to threaten archers, dismounted men-at-arms to engage the line, but their execution in the appalling conditions was catastrophic. The English advance was a brilliant gambit that maximised their firepower and disrupted French timing. Agincourt was less a proof of English invincibility and more a testament to French disunity and the lethal consequences of poor command and control. Its legacy, however, was undeniable. It gave Henry V an aura of invincibility and created a national myth that would sustain English claims and ambitions for decades, even as the strategic reality on the ground began, slowly and painfully, to shift once more. The legend would outlive the fact, but for now, the fact was stark. France was on its knees, and an English king stood poised to become its sovereign. The Treaty of Troyes and a dual monarchy. The systematic conquest of Normandy by Henry V between 1417 and 1419 was a masterclass in ruthless, sustained warfare. This was not the flashy chevauchée of his ancestors. It was the methodical work of a master mason, laying a foundation of stone and blood. Towns like Caen, Falaise and Cherbourg fell to siege, bombardment and often starvation. Henry's policy was one of calculated terror. Resistance was met with brutal punishment, including executions and expulsions of French citizens, while prompt surrender might earn relatively lenient terms. His goal was to create a stable, administratively viable English province, and to that end, he began settling English colonists in captured towns and installing loyal officials. Normandy was being remade in the image of its conqueror from over 3 centuries prior, William the Conqueror, in a stark historical reversal. Yet, even as Henry tightened his grip on the duchy, the key to the Kingdom of France lay not in Rouen citadel, but in the serpentine politics of the French Civil War. The two factions, Burgundian and Armagnac, were locked in a death struggle. The Dauphin Charles, a frail and indecisive figure, was a puppet of the vengeful Armagnac hardliners. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, controlled Paris and the person of the mad King Charles VI. Both sides saw the English invasion as a secondary threat to their primary enemy, each other. In 1418, the Burgundians seized Paris in a bloody coup, massacring the Armagnac leaders there. The Dauphin fled south to Bourges, becoming the so-called King of Bourges. The following year, in a desperate bid for reconciliation, the two sides arranged a meeting on the bridge at Montereau. It was a trap, or at least a colossal failure of security. As the Dauphin and the Duke knelt to parley, members of the Dauphin's retinue fell upon John the Fearless and murdered him, splitting his skull with an axe. This act of political assassination was the single most consequential event of the entire later phase of the war. John's death transformed the conflict. His son and successor, Philip the Good, was consumed by one overriding passion: vengeance against the Dauphin and the Armagnacs. The path to that vengeance led directly to Henry I. Philip saw in the formidable English king the instrument of his retribution. Henry, recognising the opportunity of a lifetime, moved with alacrity and diplomatic skill. He offered Philip an alliance, territorial concessions, and a shared enemy. With the Burgundian alliance secured, the road to Paris and to the ultimate prize was open. In May 1420, Henry and Philip, with the acquiescence of the helpless Queen Isabeau, who had essentially repudiated the Dauphin claiming he was a bastard, forced the tottering, intermittently lucid King Charles VI to sign the Treaty of Troyes. The treaty was a staggering political and constitutional revolution. Its terms were breathtaking. Henry V would marry Catherine, daughter of Charles VI. More importantly, he was recognised as the heir and regent of France. Upon the death of Charles VI, the crowns of France and England would be permanently united in the person of Henry and his heirs. The Dauphin, Charles, was explicitly disinherited and declared unfit to rule due to the horrible and enormous crimes perpetrated in his name. In essence, the Treaty of Troyes legally transferred the succession of the French crown to the House of Lancaster. It created the phantom of a dual monarchy, a single ruler for two distinct kingdoms. In December 1420, Henry made a triumphant entry into Paris alongside Charles VI and Philip of Burgundy. To the Parisians, weary of civil war and attracted to Burgundian order, Henry appeared not as a conqueror, but as a guarantor of peace and a legitimate heir. The reality, of course, was far more fragile. The treaty was a Burgundian-backed coup d'etat, not a national consensus. Large swathes of France, particularly the south and centre, remained loyal to the disinherited Dauphin. The Kingdom of Bourges was a rump state, but it was a state nonetheless, with its own administration, its own meagre finances, and the lingering, if tarnished, legitimacy of the bloodline. Henry V now faced the task of making the Treaty of Troyes a reality by force of arms, subjugating the Dauphin's territories. He campaigned relentlessly through 1421 and 1422, but the war had become a grinding struggle for fortified towns. The bloom of Agincourt was off the rose. This was hard, expensive siege warfare. Then, in August 1422, at the Château de Vincennes, Henri the Yahov, the brilliant, ruthless architect of the dual monarchy, died of dysentery at the age of 35. He left his vast claims to his 9-month-old son, Henry VI. 2 months later, the wretched Charles VI also died. By the terms of Troyes, the baby in Windsor Castle was now technically King of England and France. One quirky, symbolic footnote from this period involves the seals and titles. After Troyes, Henry V and later his infant son styled themselves heir of France, and used seals that combined the arms of England and France. However, in a telling detail, on the French side of the seal, they used the title Rex Francorum, King of the Franks, the ancient Carolingian formula, rather than Rex Franciae, King of France, perhaps in a legalistic attempt to emphasise a different, more personal kind of sovereignty over the people rather than the land, a nuance lost on everyone but the clerks. The dual monarchy existed only on parchment and in the occupied zones of the north. In reality, two Frances faced each other. Lancastrian France, governed from Paris and Rouen by Henry V's capable brother, John, Duke of Bedford, in alliance with Burgundy, and Valois France, a shrinking realm south of the Loire, ruled by the lethargic and politically paralysed Dauphin, Charles VII. The Dauphin's court was a nest of intrigue and despair. He had been disinherited by his own mother, branded a murderer and a bastard, and had suffered repeated military defeats. His confidence was shattered. The English, under Bedford, pressed their advantage, winning a decisive victory at Verneuil in 1424, a battle some called a Second Agincourt. They then began to push south of the Loire, laying siege to the key city of Orléans in 1428. If Orléans fell, the road to the Dauphin's heartland in Berry would be open, and the rump Valois kingdom might be extinguished altogether. The fortunes of the House of Valois had reached their lowest ebb. The cause of the disinherited Dauphin seemed hopeless, a lost cause awaiting its final chapter. It was at this precise moment of profound existential crisis, with the English besieging Orléans, that history, or what would be remembered as divine providence, intervened in a form no chronicler, diplomat, or general could have predicted. A teenage peasant girl from the marches of Lorraine, claiming she had been sent by God to save France. Scholars still hotly debate the Treaty of Troyes. Was it a legitimate, if forced, settlement that could have brought lasting peace to a war-torn realm under a strong dynasty? Or was it always an illegitimate fantasy, a Burgundian-backed foreign occupation that a majority of the French nation would never accept? Its legality hinged on the authority of a mad king and a queen whose loyalties were suspect. It created a constitutional monster, a single monarch ruling two sovereign, often antagonistic kingdoms. Could such an entity have survived? The sheer scale of English ambition laid bare at Troyes may have guaranteed its own failure, rallying a latent French nationalism around the disinherited Dauphin in a way that the old dynastic claims of Edward III never did. The treaty didn't end the war. It merely set the terms for its most dramatic and ideological phase, transforming a feudal struggle into a war of national salvation and expulsion. The Maid of Orleans, The winter of 1428-29 was a season of deep frost and deeper despair for the faction clinging to the disinherited Dauphin Charles. The key strategic city of Orléans, the last major bulwark north of the Loire guarding his territories, was encircled by English and Burgundian forces. Its fall seemed inevitable, a death knell for the Valois cause. In the Dauphin's threadbare court at Chinon, intrigue and defeatism swirled around a king who was more a figurehead of failure than a leader. Then, in March 1429, a rumour began to circulate, a story so outlandish it seemed like a folk tale. A young woman, claiming to be sent by God, had arrived from the remote eastern marches of Lorraine, demanding an audience with the Dauphin. She said her name was Jeanne, but history would remember her as Joan of Arc. Joan's origins were as humble as they come. The daughter of a peasant farmer from Domremy, a village on the frayed edge of the French kingdom, she was illiterate, devout, and from her early teens the subject of what she described as divine visions. Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, she said, spoke to her, commanding her to do two impossible things. First, to raise the siege of Orléans, and second, to lead the Dauphin to the sacred city of Reims to be crowned King of France. That she, a teenage girl in a world governed by arms, lineage, and clerical authority, could conceive of this mission was astonishing. That she managed to convince a local nobleman to escort her through enemy-held territory to Chinon was a miracle of sheer force of personality. When she finally stood before the Dauphin in the great hall of Chinon, he tested her. Disguised among his courtiers, he let another man wear the royal garments. Joan, according to legend, walked unerringly past the decoy, knelt before the unassuming Charles and said, "Very noble Lord Dauphin, I am come, sent by God to bring succour to you and your kingdom." She's also said to have privately revealed to him a secret known only to him and God, often interpreted as a reassurance about the legitimacy of his birth, the very heart of his insecurities. Whether through conviction, desperation, or political cunning, Charles decided to gamble on her. He had her examined by a panel of theologians at Poitiers. Their verdict was cautiously favourable. They found no heresy in her, only profound piety and a simple, stubborn conviction. They could find no evil in her, and given the desperate state of the realm, they concluded it was permissible to use what might be an instrument of God. Charles equipped her with a suit of white armour, a banner bearing the image of Christ and the fleur-de-lis, and gave her a place with the relief army being sent to Orléans. She was not a military commander in the traditional sense, but a charismatic and spiritual figurehead, a maid, la pucelle, whose presence transformed the army's morale. To the superstitious soldiers, she was a living charm, a sign that God had switched sides. To the English besiegers, she was a witch, a blasphemer, an abomination in men's clothing. The relief of Orléans in May 1429 was less a single battle than a series of daring, aggressive assaults on the English bastilles, fortified towers, surrounding the city. Joan was in the thick of the fighting, her banner a rallying point. Her greatest contribution was not tactical genius, but an unshakable aggression that overcame the French habit of cautious defence. At the key fort of Les Tourelles, she was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder, but returned to lead the final charge. Within days, the English commanders, their morale shattered by this unexpected fervour, abandoned the siege. The victory was less a military masterpiece than a psychological earthquake. The invincible English, who had not lost a major engagement in decades, had been routed by a peasant girl. For the Valois cause, it was a transfusion of lifeblood. Joan, her credibility divinely validated, urged an immediate march on Reims for the coronation. Against the advice of more cautious commanders who favoured clearing the Loire Valley first, Charles, sensing the moment, agreed. The march to Reims was a triumphant procession rather than a military campaign. Town after town in Champagne opened its gates to the Maid and her Dauphin. The English and Burgundians, reeling from the shock of Orléans, could not muster a defence. On July 17, 1429, in the majestic Reims Cathedral, the ancient sacral site where French kings were anointed with the holy oil from the Saint-Ampoule, Charles VII was crowned King of France. Joan stood beside him, her banner in hand. In that moment, the legal fiction of the Treaty of Troyes was confronted with a powerful counter-reality, a Valois king, crowned with holy sacrament in the presence of a maiden who claimed the mandate of heaven. The King of Bourges had been transformed into the Lord's anointed. Joan's primary mission was astoundingly complete. One fringe, eerie detail from Joan's campaigns involves her sword. At her request, clerics sent to her home village of Domremy to search for a legendary sword buried behind the altar of the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois. Astonishingly, they found it, rusted but inscribed with 5 crosses. Joan claimed her saints had told her of it. To her followers, it was Excalibur-like proof of her divine mission. To her enemies, it was just another piece of diabolical stagecraft. The sword broke during her later campaigns, a bad omen she reportedly took in stride. After Reims, the nature of Joan's mission and her relationship with Charles's court became more complex. The cautious, political men around the king, like Georges de la Trémoille, were wary of her overwhelming influence and her insistence on relentless offensive action. The honeymoon period following the coronation faded as military reality reasserted itself. An attack on Paris in September 1429 failed, with Joan wounded again. The following spring, during a skirmish outside the Burgundian-held town of Compiègne, she was captured. Isolated during a retreat, she was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian archer. Charles VII, now secure in his crown and perhaps finding the maid an inconvenient figure, made no serious effort to ransom or rescue her. For the Burgundians, she was a valuable political pawn. They sold her to their English allies for 10,000 livres. The English were determined to destroy not just her body but her legend. To do that, they needed to prove her a heretic and a witch, thus discrediting Charles's coronation as the work of the devil. Scholars still vigorously debate the true source of Joan of Arc's influence. Was she a genuine mystic, a rare and profound example of religious experience shaping history? Was she a brilliantly manipulated tool, her visions perhaps seeded or encouraged by shrewd political factions at the Dauphin's court who understood the power of propaganda? Or was she, most compellingly, a person of such immense, unshakable personal conviction that she became a force of nature, bending the sceptical, rigid world of 15th century politics and war to her will? Whatever the source, her impact was undeniable. In less than a year, she had reversed the momentum of the war, turned a psychological cripple into a crowned king, and injected the Valois cause with a potent new ideology, that of a sacred French nation, worth saving not just for its princes but for itself. Her capture did not end this idea. It merely transferred its embodiment from a living girl to an incipient legend. Her trial, and what followed, would ensure that legend would burn brighter than any earthly fire. The burning and the unmaking of a saint. The transfer of Joan of Arc from Burgundian to English custody in late 1430 was a transaction in political poison. For the English regime ruling occupied France, led by the Duke of Bedford, Joan was not merely a prisoner of war. She was the living symbol of their divinely sanctioned illegitimacy. Her claims had invalidated the Treaty of Troyes in the eyes of many, and her presence at Charles VII's coronation had sacralized their rival. She could not be treated as a normal captive, ransomed or exchanged. She had to be destroyed, and her destruction had to be framed not as a political execution, but as a holy necessity. To this end, the English handed her over to the Church, funding a trial for heresy in an ecclesiastical court under their control. The stage for this judicial farce was Rouen, the seat of English power in Normandy. The presiding judge was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a fiercely pro-Burgundian cleric whose diocese Joan had invaded during the march to Reims, giving him a thin veneer of jurisdiction. From the outset, the trial's purpose was not to ascertain truth, but to construct a damning narrative. The proceedings, which began in February 1431, were a masterpiece of malicious intent draped in legalistic pomp. Joan was held in a secular prison, guarded by English soldiers, rather than in a church prison with nuns, a condition that left her vulnerable and isolated. Cauchon and a panel of assessors, many of whom had English sympathies, interrogated her relentlessly over months. The charges centred on her voices, her wearing of men's clothing, a violation of Deuteronomy's injunction, and her alleged idolatry in worshipping her banner. Through it all, Joan's responses were a remarkable blend of peasant shrewdness, steadfast faith, and simple eloquence. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a theological trap, as the Church taught no one could be certain of this, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It silenced her interrogators. she maintained that her voices were real and from God, and that her actions were done at their command. The trial's climax came in May, after a public admonition at the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, where she was threatened with immediate execution. Joan, terrified by the sight of the pyre, signed a short document of abjuration, essentially recanting her voices and agreeing to wear women's clothes. She was then returned to her English prison. The sources are murky on what happened next, but within days she had resumed wearing male attire. The official reason given was that her guards had removed her female dress, leaving her no choice, or that she had been assaulted. A more compelling explanation is that the act of abjuration had broken her spirit and her connection to her divine mandate. Returning to men's clothing was a way of reclaiming her identity and her mission, even if it meant death. For Cauchon and the English, it was the gift they needed. She was a relapsed heretic, and the law was clear. On May 30th, 1431, she was led to the old market square in Rouen, tied to a tall pillar and burned alive. To ensure nothing remained for veneration, her ashes were gathered and cast into the Seine. The English had achieved their goal. The maid was dead, her body turned to dust and scattered. But in their attempt to annihilate her memory, they committed a catastrophic error. They had made a martyr. The spectacle of a 19-year-old girl being burned by a foreign-backed church court backfired horribly. Even within the trial records, the blatant injustice and the courage of the defendant were evident. In France, the story of her end fueled outrage and solidified her legend. Charles VII, who had done nothing to save her, could now quietly benefit from the symbolism of his martyred champion. The English, by overreaching and turning a military prisoner into a religious victim, had inadvertently sanctified the very cause they sought to discredit. Joan's death did not break the French spirit. It became the foundational myth of French resistance. One quirky, macabre legend that emerged in the aftermath claims that Joan's heart would not burn. Several English soldiers present at the pyre were said to have testified that despite the flames consuming her body, her heart remained intact and full of blood, defying the fire. The executioner was then ordered to gather all the remains and cast them into the river to prevent any such relics from being venerated. This story, though almost certainly apocryphal, speaks to the immediate supernatural aura that grew around her death, a sense that her sacrifice was so potent it defied the natural order. The years following Joan's death saw a slow but perceptible shift in the war's momentum, though not an immediate reversal. The English, under the regency for the young Henry VI, struggled with factionalism and waning finances. In 1435, a seismic political event occurred, the Congress of Arras. It was a grand peace conference meant to end the war. The English, overconfident and intransigent, refused any compromise that involved Henry VI renouncing the title of King of France. This proved to be their undoing. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had grown weary of the expensive, stalemated conflict. The English refusal to offer meaningful concessions, combined with skillful French diplomacy and perhaps a growing Burgundian identification with the French, realm he technically still belonged to, led Philip to break with his English allies. The Treaty of Arras, signed between Burgundy and Charles VII, was a masterpiece of French statecraft. Charles offered Philip territorial concessions, monetary gifts, and, crucially, a profound and humiliating apology for the murder of his father, John the Fearless, at Montereau. The Duke was also exempted from doing homage to the king for life. In return, Philip recognised Charles as the true King of France. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance, the very foundation of the Lancastrian dual monarchy, was shattered. Scholars still debate the precise weight of Joan of Arc's legacy in the subsequent French recovery. Did her intervention directly cause the turning of the tide, or did she merely hasten a process that was already underway due to English overextension and Burgundian war weariness? Her most concrete achievements, the relief of Orléans and the coronation at Reims, were undeniable military and political catalysts. But perhaps her greater contribution was intangible. She transformed a dynastic squabble into a national mission, giving the Valois cause a sacred popular legitimacy it had previously lacked. She embodied the idea of France as something worth dying for, an idea that, once planted, proved impossible for the English occupiers to uproot. With Burgundy's defection, Charles VII was now free to unleash the full, reformed machinery of the French state, funded by permanent taxes and guided by a new generation of commanders who had learned from both the disasters of the past and the shocking success of the Maid. The war was not over, but its character changed irrevocably. The English were no longer the masters of the field. They were a garrison force in a shrinking territory, about to face the full, methodical and technologically advanced might of a resurgent French monarchy. The Burgundian betrayal and French reconquest. The defection of Burgundy at the Congress of Arras in 1435 was not a sudden betrayal, but the calculated realignment of a state within a state. For 2 decades, the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had walked a razor's edge, leveraging his alliance with England to expand his own power and secure vengeance against the Armagnacs. But by the mid-1430s, the calculus had changed. The English were no longer the invincible force of Agincourt. They were a financially strained occupation regime, unable to deliver decisive victory. The Dauphin turned King Charles VII, meanwhile, had been legitimised by coronation and was demonstrating a newfound political maturity. Most importantly, the English refusal at Arras to offer any meaningful concession to Philip. They insisted he acknowledge Henry VI as King of France without compromise was a fatal diplomatic blunder. It told Philip that his interests would always be secondary to English dynastic obsession. Charles VI's offer, by contrast, was breathtakingly generous. Vast, territorial concessions, a royal pardon for past offences, exemption from homage, and a staggering 200,000 gold écus. Perhaps most potent of all was the ceremonial atonement for the murder of John the Fearless at Montereau, a symbolic balm for a 15-year-old wound. Philip took the deal. The Burgundian pivot was the single greatest strategic reversal of the entire war's later phase. It didn't just deprive the English of their most powerful ally, it unleashed the full military potential of the French crown. Charles VII, often derided as Charles the Well-Served, now proved the wisdom of that epithet. He had spent the years since his coronation not in glorious campaigns, but in the unglamorous work of state-building. He had created the first standing army in Western Europe since Roman times, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, permanent units of heavy cavalry paid directly by the crown, loyal to the state rather than to individual lords. He regularised taxation through the tile, providing a reliable war chest, and he embraced new military technology, particularly the rapid development of siege artillery under master gunners like Jean and Gaspard Bureau. With Burgundy neutralised, Charles could turn this reformed war machine against the English holdings in the Ile-de-France and Normandy, no longer fearing a stab in the back from the east. The French reconquest began in earnest in the late 1430s. It was a campaign characterised not by dramatic field battles, but by the methodical, grinding reduction of fortified places. The strategy was one of relentless pressure and expert siegecraft. Paris, weary of English rule and high taxes, fell without a fight in 1436, opening its gates to the Constable de Richemont. Throughout the 1440s, French forces advanced steadily. The English, led by the Duke of York and later the redoubtable John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, fought tenaciously in defence, but they were hamstrung by dwindling resources and a lack of support from an England increasingly divided and war-weary. The English Parliament was reluctant to fund a lost cause, and the court of Henry VI was fractured by rivalries that would eventually erupt into the Wars of the Roses. The French, by contrast, were united as never before, their king's authority bolstered by the pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, 1438, which asserted Gallican church liberties and gave him greater control over ecclesiastical resources. A key moment in this process was the French capture of the fortified town of Meaux in 1439. The siege demonstrated the new French way of war, a tight blockade, the systematic use of cannon to breach walls, and aggressive assault. But more than a military victory, it was a political statement. Holding Meaux secured the approaches to Paris and demonstrated Charles's commitment to reclaiming his realm piece by piece. The English responded with sporadic chevauchées, but these now seemed like the thrashings of a wounded beast, causing damage, but incapable of halting the French advance. The French population in occupied territories, tired of foreign rule and attracted by the stability promised by Charles's growing administration, increasingly acquiesced to the return of Valois authority. One quirky and lesser-known facet of this period involves the court of love in occupied Normandy. As English settlers and administrators tried to establish a permanent society, there are records of them holding chivalric courts of love and poetry competitions, attempting to recreate a cultured Anglo-French aristocratic life, even as the military situation deteriorated around them. It was a bizarre cultural bubble, a last poignant echo of the dual monarchy ideal, existing in a state of profound denial about the collapsing reality outside the castle walls. The French momentum culminated in a bold strategic decision. In 1449, Charles VII formally broke a truce with England, citing English breaches in Brittany. What followed was the Reconquête of Normandy, a stunningly swift campaign that showcased the complete transformation of French military power. The French army, now a professional force, swept through the duchy. Their artillery train, the most advanced in Europe, reduced castles and walled towns in days or weeks rather than months. The psychological impact of the new cannons was as devastating as their physical effect. At the Siege of Rouen in October 1449, the capital of English Normandy, the sight of the French bombards and the lack of hope for relief compelled the city to surrender after just a few weeks. The English garrison was allowed to march out with honours, but their rule was over. By the summer of 1450, the last major English field army in Normandy was cornered at Formigny. There, the French combined their new arms with the old. A classic English defensive position was disrupted by a charge of Breton cavalry, and then shattered by the concentrated fire of 2 culverins brought up from the French rear. It was a hybrid victory, the last gasp of the longbow era meeting the dawn of the gunpowder age. With Formigny lost, the remaining English strongholds capitulated. By August 1450, Normandy, conquered by Henry V a generation earlier, was entirely back in French hands. Scholars still debate the primary engine of the French reconquest. Was it the military reforms of Charles VII, the standing army and the artillery? Was it the political masterstroke of detaching Burgundy? Or was it simply the inevitable result of English overextension and the awakening of a French national consciousness, seeded by Joan of Arc and nurtured by resentment of foreign occupation? The answer is a confluence of all three. The Burgundian defection was the essential precondition, freeing French resources. The military reforms provided the tool, and the growing sense of a France that was more than a king's personal property provided the will and the legitimacy. The English, who had fought for over a century to uphold a dynastic claim, now found themselves confronting a nation. The final act of the war would shift south to the last English possession, Gascony. And there, on a field near Castillon, the new French way of war would deliver its definitive, thunderous verdict, bringing the long conflict to its abrupt and definitive end. The Gunpowder Revolution. The reconquest of Normandy had been a demonstration of systemic strength, but the campaign that followed in Gascony would serve as the brutal, definitive showcase of a technological revolution. For over a century, the English tactical system, the combination of dismounted men-at-arms and massed longbowmen, had dominated the battlefields of France. It was a system of movement, discipline and projectile supremacy. By 1450, that supremacy was being overturned not by a better bow, but by the controlled explosion of gunpowder. The masterminds of this transformation were 2 brothers in the service of Charles VII, Jean and Gaspard Bureau. Jean, the master of artillery, was an administrative and technical genius who standardized calibers, improved logistics for powder and shot, and integrated artillery as a central arm of the French military, not just a cumbersome siege novelty. Under their direction, French cannons became lighter, more mobile, and far more numerous. The difference was one of philosophy. Earlier bombards were monolithic, slow-moving beasts used to batter walls in static sieges. The Bureau brothers' artillery train was a flexible system of field guns, coulevrins, Vauglairs and serpentines, that could keep pace with an army and be deployed tactically. This revolution changed the very nature of siege warfare. Where once a castle could hold out for months, hoping for relief, or for the besiegers to run out of supplies, now its walls could be breached in a matter of days by concentrated cannon fire. The economic and psychological impact was profound. The cost of defending a territory skyrocketed, as old vertical stone walls became death traps. The fortified bastides of Gascony, which had defined the region's warfare for centuries, were suddenly obsolete. When Charles VII turned his attention to Gascony in 1451, the campaign was shockingly swift. An army under the Count of Dunois, supported by Bureau's artillery, swept south. Bordeaux, the great wine metropolis and heart of English Gascony for 300 years, capitulated in June 1451 after a brief bombardment. The city's capitulation was not just a military defeat for England, it was an economic catastrophe, severing the lucrative wine trade that had financed the Plantagenet and later Lancastrian war efforts for generations. The French administration moved in, but it was unpopular. The Gascon nobility and merchant class had grown accustomed to their semi-autonomous status under distant English rule, which often meant lower taxes and favourable trading rights. The stricter, more centralised French administration chafed. Within a year, secret appeals were sent to London begging for an English expedition to restore the ancient liberties of Gascony. England, reeling from the loss of Normandy and the rising domestic tensions that would soon erupt into the Wars of the Roses, found a final champion in the legendary John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. Now in his 70s, Talbot was a figure from an earlier age, a fearless commander whose entire life had been shaped by the war in France. In October 1452, he led a small but veteran force to Gascony. His arrival triggered a pro-English uprising. Bordeaux threw open its gates, ejecting the French garrison, and other towns followed. It was a stunning, if fleeting, reversal. Talbot's success, however, was built on nostalgia and localised discontent, not sustainable military power. He lacked the troops to hold the countryside, and Charles VII's response was immediate and overwhelming. In the spring of 1453, a massive French army, perhaps 10,000 strong and accompanied by Jean Bureau's entire artillery train, reportedly up to 300 guns of various sizes, marched to crush the rebellion and end the English presence in France for good. Talbot, the old lion, knew he could not withstand a siege in Bordeaux. His only hope was to take the offensive, to defeat the French army in the field before it could invest the city. In July 1453, he marched out with a force of perhaps 6,000 men, a mix of English veterans and Gascon allies, to relieve the town of Castillon, which was under French attack. What he found upon arriving on July 17th was not a traditional camp, but something entirely new, a fortified artillery park. Jean Bureau, anticipating an attack, had constructed a formidable entrenched camp on a slope east of Castillon, protected by a ditch, a palisade, and with his hundreds of cannons meticulously positioned to cover every approach. It was a death trap disguised as a campsite. One fringe but fascinating tidbit from the Bureau brothers' work involves the early science of ballistics. To achieve the rapid, concentrated fire that defined their tactics, they had to solve problems of powder consistency, shot weight, and barrel wear. It's believed they employed one of the earliest forms of standardized measurement for shot using lead templates to ensure cannonballs fit their barrels precisely. A move from craft to proto-industrial military science that gave them a crucial edge in rate and accuracy of fire. The Battle of Castillon was less a battle than a calculated slaughter. Talbot, arriving ahead of his main force and receiving flawed reconnaissance that suggested the French were retreating, ordered an immediate cavalry charge against the camp. It was a catastrophic mistake. As the English and Gascon horsemen surged forward, the entire French line erupted in fire and smoke. A storm of cannon and handgun shot ripped through the charging ranks. The noise was described as deafening, the carnage instantaneous. Talbot's son, Lord Lisle, was killed at his side. The old earl, thrown from his horse, was finished off by a French archer. The main English body, arriving to see the vanguard annihilated, was then set upon by a French cavalry sortie. The rout was total. English and Gascon casualties numbered in the thousands, while French losses were minimal. The thunder at Castillon echoed far beyond the Dordogne Valley. It was the loudest possible period at the end of a very long sentence. Bordeaux, now hopeless, surrendered on October 19, 1453, after a 3-month blockade. There was no treaty, no formal peace. The war simply ceased. England retained only the Pale of Calais, a lonely toehold on the continent. The 100 Years' War was over. Scholars still debate whether gunpowder was the decisive factor in ending the war, or if it merely accelerated an inevitable conclusion driven by French political consolidation and English exhaustion. There is no doubt, however, that Castillon stands as a stark symbolic turning point. It marked the definitive end of the medieval way of war, where individual prowess and the massed volley of the longbow yielded to engineering, centralised command and industrialised firepower. The knight-errant was now vulnerable to the smoke-belching metal tube served by a common gunner. The Bureau brothers and Charles VII had not just won a war, They had ushered in a new age of warfare where the state that could best organise, finance and deploy technology would dominate. The long conflict that had begun over a disputed succession ended with a demonstration of a new kind of power, one that would shape the modern world. The Last Battle, Castillon, 1453. The morning of July 17, 1453, dawned hot and still over the Dordogne Valley. In the fortified French artillery park east of Castillon, Master Jean Bureau surveyed his handiwork. His guns, perhaps 300 pieces ranging from massive bombards to smaller coulevrines, were not merely placed, they were emplaced, integrated into a designed landscape of death. A ditch and an earthen rampart bolstered by a wooden palisade enclosed the camp, with the artillery positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. This was not a temporary bivouac. It was a fortress built in weeks, a manifestation of a new military doctrine where firepower, engineering and disciplined defence superseded martial élan. Across the river, the town of Castillon was under French siege, the bait in a meticulously laid trap. All that was needed now was the arrival of the old warhound, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. Talbot, aged about 66 but still possessing the fierce energy that had made him England's most feared captain in France, had marched from Bordeaux with a force of roughly 6,000 men. His aim was to relieve Castillon, rally Gascon support, and repeat the miracle of the previous year. As he approached, his scouts reported dust clouds near the French camp, which they misinterpreted as signs of a retreat. It was likely the movement of the French camp followers, whom Bureau had ordered to withdraw to a safer distance, but to Talbot's desperate, aggressive mind, it signalled opportunity. Here was the critical failure, the absence of proper reconnaissance. The era of the impulsive chivalric charge collided with the new era of calculated technological warfare, and Talbot did not pause to understand what he was facing. Eager to strike a retreating enemy, he detached his mounted men-at-arms and a body of mounted archers and ordered an immediate assault, not waiting for his infantry and artillery to deploy in support. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was an ambush on a grand scale. As the English cavalry, led by Talbot himself, thundered down the slope and across the shallow river, they were met not by fleeing troops, but by a wall of silent timber and earth. Then the world exploded. Bureau's gunners touched off their pieces in a coordinated shattering volley. The noise was described as being like thunder from the ground itself. A storm of iron shot, cannonballs, langrage and arrows of fire swept through the close-packed cavalry. Horses and men were torn apart. The charge dissolved into a chaotic, bloody scramble. In the smoke and confusion, Talbot's son, Lord Lisle, was reportedly killed by a direct cannon shot. The old Earl, his horse shot from under him, was pinned beneath the carcass. A French archer, recognising the legendary commander, finished him with a battle-axe. The vanguard was annihilated in minutes. The main English force, arriving on the ridge to witness this horror, was then subjected to a relentless cannonade. Bureau's guns, now ranging on the dense formations of English and Gascon infantry, continued their work. The psychological effect of this sustained, distant violence was as devastating as the physical carnage. The English longbowmen, the terror of Europe for over a century, found themselves utterly outranged and impotent. Their arrows fell short of the French lines, while iron shot ploughed into their ranks. After enduring this punishment, the Anglo-Gascon army broke. A final cavalry charge from the French camp, led by the Breton captain Jean de Buet, turned the retreat into a rout. The pursuit was merciless. The slaughter continued along the roads back to the river, where many drowned trying to escape. English casualties numbered in the high thousands, a catastrophic loss of the last professional army England would field in France for generations. French losses were trifling, perhaps 100 men. The disparity was a perfect, brutal summary of the technological and doctrinal shift that had occurred. The aftermath unfolded with grim inevitability. With Talbot dead and his army destroyed, the Gascon rebellion lost its heart. Bordeaux, now utterly isolated, held out for 3 more months under a blockade, but hope was gone. On October 19, 1453, the city surrendered to Charles VII. The terms were lenient. Charles was wise enough not to martyr the city, but definitive. The English were expelled. The great Duchy of Aquitaine, held by the English crown in some form since 1152, was no more. There was no triumphant treaty signed, no formal abdication of the English claim. The war simply stopped, ended not by diplomacy, but by decisive military reality. The 100 Years' War, a conflict lasting 116 years, petered out not with a bang, but with the lingering echo of cannon fire and the closing of Bordeaux's gates to English ships. One quirky, poignant footnote to Castillon involves Talbot's reputation. In a strange twist of cultural memory, the man who died charging guns became a romantic hero in both England and France. English ballads mourned the good old Talbot, a last champion of chivalry. In France, his death was celebrated, but his bravery was also respected. Chroniclers painted him as a noble, if tragically outdated, foe. This shared admiration for a fallen enemy underscores how the myth of chivalry persisted, even as the reality that killed it, impersonal artillery, was etching its signature on the battlefield. With the fall of Bordeaux, England retained only the port of Calais, a solitary remnant of its continental empire. The war was over, but its ending was so abrupt, so devoid of ceremony, that contemporaries did not immediately recognise it as the end. In England, the news from Castillon was swallowed by the gathering storm of domestic conflict. The mental and physical exhaustion from the French war, combined with the financial ruin and the loss of prestige, fueled the power struggles that would erupt just 2 years later into the dynastic civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. The English nobility, whose fortunes and identities had been shaped by the war in France, now turned their seasoned violence inward upon each other. In France, Charles VII, the victorious, could finally turn his full attention to consolidating his kingdom, subduing overmighty subjects, integrating newly recovered territories, and building the apparatus of a modern centralised state. The war that had defined both nations for over a century had forcibly forged their modern identities. England was compelled to look inward, toward its island status. France emerged with hardened borders and a strengthened, if still not absolute, monarchy. Scholars still debate whether the Battle of Castillon alone was responsible for ending the war. Could the English have recovered, as they had after other disasters? The evidence suggests not. The defeat was total, but more importantly, the political and financial will in England to continue had evaporated. The Gascon uprising of 1452-53 was a last spasm, a nostalgia for the old Plantagenet relationship, not a viable foundation for renewed conquest. Castillon provided the definitive, undeniable exclamation point. It proved that the French military revolution was complete, and that any future English expedition would face not only the new artillery, but a united French kingdom with a professional army. The era of the plundering chevauchée and the set-piece victory of the longbow was irretrievably past. The future belonged to the state that could command the foundry, the treasury, and the drill field. The aftermath. Forged nations. The dust settled over Castillon, the guns of Bureau fell silent, and the wine trade of Bordeaux slowly reoriented itself toward Paris rather than London. But the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453 did not bring a clear, ringing peace. It brought an exhausted, ambiguous silence. In England, there was no formal renunciation of the claim to the French crown. Henry VI continued to style himself King of France, and English monarchs would quarter the fleur-de-lis with the lions of England for centuries to come. In France, Charles VII did not issue a grand proclamation of victory. The conflict simply ceased to be militarily viable, its energy spent. Yet, from this inconclusive end emerged consequences that would permanently reshape both kingdoms, forging the contours of the early modern nation-state in the fires of protracted war. In France, the most immediate impact was the dramatic strengthening of royal authority. The war had demonstrated the catastrophic cost of a divided nobility, as seen in the Burgundian-Armagnac feud. Charles VII, leveraging the crisis, had created institutions that bypassed feudal power structures. The standing army, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, owed its loyalty directly to the crown, not to individual dukes or counts. The permanent tax, the taille, funded this army independently of the Estates General, giving the monarchy financial autonomy. The Gallican Church, its liberties asserted in the pragmatic sanction of Bourges, became a more national institution. The need to administer reconquered territories led to a more professional bureaucracy. In short, the war provided the pretext and the necessity for centralisation. The Valois monarchy emerged not just victorious over England, but victorious over its own fractious internal rivals. The idea of France as a unified territorial entity with borders that needed to be defended and a king who was its sovereign embodiment was cemented in blood and gunpowder. In England, the effect was paradoxically similar, but born of defeat. The loss of all continental territories except Calais forced a fundamental reorientation. England's aristocracy and monarchy could no longer derive their wealth, status and purpose from lucrative French estates and military adventure. Their horizons shrank to the British Isles. This inward turn intensified the stakes of domestic politics, as the great magnates now fought over a finite pie of English land and royal favour. The monumental debt, the loss of prestige, and the bitter recriminations following the French collapse directly fueled the dynastic struggle between York and Lancaster, the Wars of the Roses. The war had created a class of battle-hardened, politically ambitious nobles with private armies, a dangerous combination in a kingdom with no foreign outlet for their violence. Thus, the 100 Years' War, by ending in English defeat, set the stage for the civil wars that would dominate the next 30 years, which in turn would ultimately lead to a strengthened Tudor monarchy by the century's end. The war also accelerated social and military revolutions. The devastation in France was apocalyptic in some regions, but the resulting labour shortage empowered peasants, leading to the gradual erosion of serfdom. The myth of invincible knightly aristocracy had been shattered first by the longbow at Crécy and Poitiers, and finally by the commoner manned cannon at Castillon. Warfare became more professional, less the domain of the noble amateur. The financial demands of the war spurred developments in taxation, credit, and administration in both countries. Perhaps most profoundly, the conflict fostered nascent nationalism. On the French side, this was crystallised by Joan of Arc, the idea of a sacred patrie to be saved. On the English side, a sense of distinctive identity was forged in opposition to France, fed by decades of propaganda and the shared experience of campaigns. The war created national myths and antipathies that would linger for centuries. One quirky legacy, often overlooked, is the linguistic impact. In England, the association of the French language with the enemy aristocracy accelerated the decline of Anglo-Norman French in legal and governmental circles. By the end of the 14th century, English had reasserted itself as the language of law and literature, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales being a prime example, a process hastened by the patriotic fervour of a long war against France. Conversely, in France, the langue d'oil of the Parisian court began to be promoted as the standard French language, part of the project of royal centralisation over regions with their own dialects and languages like Occitan. The human cost defies comprehension. While no reliable census exists, estimates suggest France lost half its population from a combination of warfare, famine, and the Black Death during the period. Entire regions were depopulated, their villages desert. England, while spared invasion, poured generations of men and treasure into the continental abyss, leaving it financially broken and socially scarred. The war was a demographic and economic catastrophe that took over a century to unfold. Scholars still debate the most enduring legacy of the 100 Years' War. Was it the birth of the modern sovereign state in France? The forging of English national consciousness? The military revolution that spelled the end of medieval knighthood? In truth, it is all these things. The war acted as a violent crucible, applying extreme and sustained pressure to the political, social and military structures of both nations. What emerged were harder, more defined entities, a France more centralised and territorially conscious, an England turned inward, its island identity sharpened, and a new way of waging war that favoured the state over the individual, the treasurer over the champion, the cannon over the lance. It marked the painful, protracted close of the Middle Ages and the difficult, bloody dawn of the early modern era. The two kingdoms, forever linked by this epic struggle, stepped out of the long shadow of the war not as victor and vanquished in simple terms, but as nations fundamentally transformed, their futures irrevocably shaped by the relentless grinding conflict that had consumed their past. Conclusion. The story that began with the disputed succession in 1328 ends not on a battlefield or in a treaty hall, but in the quiet, irreversible currents of historical change. The 100 Years' War was more than a series of battles. It was a seismic event that reshaped the bedrock of Western Europe. It taught brutal lessons about the cost of division and the power of unity, about the obsolescence of old ideals in the face of new technologies, and about the emergence of loyalties that transcended feudal bonds. From the ashes of its devastation rose stronger, more centralized monarchies and the first stirrings of the nation-state. The echoes of Crécy, Agincourt and Castillon are not just tales of martial glory or tragedy. They are the sound of a world changing, of the medieval order fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions and the relentless pressure of prolonged total war. The conflict reminds us that nations are often forged not in peace, but in enduring struggle, and that the borders of the modern world were frequently drawn by the unforgiving hand of history's longest conflicts. The 100 Years' War, for all its distance, thus speaks directly to our present, a testament to the enduring human capacity for both catastrophic destruction and profound reinvention.